11 years to graduate, and so her granddaughter, she's 94.
Are you talking about, what's her name?
We're going to go ahead and get started.
I know that.
Well, Jackie said she looked at
She's
me
a-
the day after we were told we were appointing her, and she said, I'm looking at the window and you were walking.
Jackie.
For anybody who's going to be going to the 11 o'clock mass, leave when you need to. We should be done well before then, but I'm guessing we'll be done probably around 10 hours. Continuing from last week, I'm Joe Van Heest. This is Fratelli Tutti through the lens of St. Martin de Tours. This is part 2. It was a 2-week presentation, and so this one is going to cover chapters 4 through 8. We had a discussion last week about racism and who can be racist, and let me just say that going outside of America, certainly you see a lot of situations where people of color can be racist. And let me give you some examples. The Chinese, the way they treat the Uyghurs, who are the Muslim group there. There were problems that were with persecution between the Hutus and the Tutsis in Rwanda that led to a genocide in the 90s. The Burmese in Myanmar, the way they have tried ethnic cleansing of the Rohingya. The Germans and the Jews in World War II. In South Africa, it was, for the longest time, it was a small white minority in power over a larger black majority. And in the United States, it has traditionally been white people as the dominant in power group, and therefore been able to set up systems. It's not just individuals, but systems that have racism lodged into them. So we're now going to move to chapter 4, though, a heart to open the whole world. And so Pope Francis calls us to encounter solidarity and gratuitousness. Last week we talked a little bit about encounter and solidarity, which I think we'll cover a little bit more of that. But what is gratuitousness? When the Pope talks about gratuitousness, he's talking about doing some things simply because they're good in themselves. Acting without concern for personal gain or recompense, welcoming strangers even though this brings us no immediate tangible benefit. Think back to chapter 2 with the Good Samaritan, and we pointed out last week how the Good Samaritan was not doing the things that he did for himself, he wasn't doing it for any personal gain, and wasn't expecting any personal gain or recompense. He wasn't doing things because he thought this is going to benefit me. He was doing it because it was good in and of itself, and he felt it to be a duty. We must do our best to welcome, protect, promote, and integrate those who arrive. That would mean those who arrive from outside of the country. That would also mean those who are already here but have not really arrived on our own radar, coming to our own attention. Our cultural identity, our own cultural identity, is strengthened and enriched as a result of dialogue with those unlike ourselves. I'm a big public television watcher, and probably about my favorite show whenever it comes on is Rick Steves' travel show. And you know, I imagine you all know who he is, but Rick Steves' travel show normally covers Europe, although not exclusively. But he talks about when he goes to Italy or to Norway or to France or anywhere else, get into the smaller towns away from the tourist areas. Go to the places where the locals eat. Immerse yourself in the culture. And he does that because it just opens doors and enriches him so much more by learning about other people. We can do the same thing when those other people are here. We don't need for them to assimilate to us. We can reach out to them. The arrival of persons who are different from us becomes a gift when we receive them with open hearts and allow them to be true to themselves. Again, we are not trying to change everybody. We are trying to encounter others. And that's what Pope Francis is calling us to do. Encountering with an open heart. That is basically chapter 4, which was a short one. We've got 2 short ones in here, but a couple of longer ones. Moving on to chapter 5, a better kind of politics. If you go back to chapter 1, where he talked about dark clouds in a closed world. Pope Francis talked about sort of the sickness in society where we are only concerned about ourselves. We're not reaching out to our brothers and sisters, either nearby or afar. And our politics reflect the same thing. And we know that. I mentioned last week, of course, we're more polarized, it seems, than we've ever been, even though we're globally able to reach each other almost immediately. But so what is a better kind of politics? It's one that truly promotes the common good, not just the benefit for a few or the powerful. It's one that does not merely seek to gain votes. It's about doing for those who aren't necessarily going to repay that back, just like in the prior chapter. It's one that serves as a channel for personal growth. And again, using the Rick Steves example, but how Pope Francis was talking to us, we can gain personally, we grow personally when we extend ourselves to others who are not like us. So it's a channel for personal growth as well. And it's farsighted and capable of new integral and interdisciplinary dialogue. Let's talk about farsighted for a second. It is easy to grow for the quick gain. I can chalk that up as a success and that up as a success. It is more difficult to be planning farsighted what's going to help in the long run. And that is what Pope Francis is encouraging in a better kind of politics, is looking down the road. Of course, down the road may not get you reelected, but down the road leaves the world a better place. So Pope Francis calls for a social and political order whose soul is social charity, making it possible to advance towards a civilization of love to which all feel called, recognizing all human beings as brothers and sisters without excluding anybody, nobody excluded. And charity needs the light of truth, the light of reason, and the light of faith. I'm going to repeat that. That's a quote. These are all actually quotes out of there. But charity needs the light of truth, the light of reason, and the light of faith. So truth, reason, and faith are non-negotiable, basically. And we need to be doing that from a political standpoint. Our politics need to show all of the three. We must put human dignity back at the center, and on that pillar, build the alternative social structures we need. Not everything can be reached by resolved by market freedom. I think it was his first encyclical, Pope Francis talked about unfettered capitalism. He wasn't saying I'm against capitalism, but an unfettered capitalism, completely unregulated, where the market drives everything, generally allows for might makes right and the powerful get to dominate. And that is kind of, in some ways, that's where we are. And what he's talking about here in a better kind of politics is we need to do for the common good for everybody, not for just some smaller group. And that market freedom, pure market freedom, will not necessarily permit that. So we have to think beyond pure market freedom. And of course, pure market freedom simply says, well, let the market handle it. I don't need to think. I don't need to come up with any ideas. We don't need to come up with any ideas. And Pope Francis is saying otherwise. We need to be creative. Thinking of those who will come after us does not serve electoral purposes, yet it is what authentic justice demands. The bishops of Portugal, in a writing, said the earth is lent to each generation to be handed on to the generation that follows. There's a native saying that I came across in a book I was listening to yesterday that says, we do not inherit the earth from our ancestors. We borrow it from our children. And I think that's really pointed toward the idea of long-term as opposed to short-term solutions. It is the land, the earth is not mine to do with whatever I want because my ancestors gave it to me. It's mine to leave for my children, for our descendants, for other people, and to leave it in a better place than we got it. Political charity. So whereas individuals can help others in need when they join together, initiating social process of fraternity and justice for all. They enter into political charity, working for a social and political order whose soul is social charity. Again, not just charity for an individual, but for a greater good. Pope Francis calls for a renewed appreciation of politics as a lofty vocation and one of the highest forms of charity, inasmuch as it seeks the common good. It's been a while since we in the United States have looked at politics as a lofty vocation, but it is and it should be viewed that way. It's a service. Remember, we talked last week about you don't serve ideas, you serve people. And that's all of the people, not just the people who voted for you and not just the people in your district. You have to consider all of the people as well. He's on the floor until he literally passes out. And that's an example, I think, of course, it's a Hollywood example, but it's an example of politics as a lofty vocation. It's an act of charity to assist someone suffering, but it's also an act of charity, even if we do not know that person, to work to change the social conditions that caused his or her suffering. Jesus talked about teaching a man to fish versus giving a man a fish versus teaching him to fish. But it's not just that. It's sometimes we have to do things beyond the immediate assistance and to try to solve bigger problems. And political charity, that's what Pope Francis is calling those involved to do. It must never be forgotten that loving the most insignificant of human beings as a brother, as if there were no one else in the world but him, cannot be considered a waste of time. That is a quote right out of paragraph 193. Even though I left the hand quotation marks off of there. But let me explain, that sounds like there's a judgment about who's significant and who's not significant. And I think what Pope Francis is talking about is those who are not significant to my personal gain, maybe insignificant. They may never be able to pay me back. They may never be able to help to make a huge impact in life. But loving that person, even if it doesn't give me any gain, it cannot be considered a waste of time. Politics is something more noble than posturing, marketing, and media spin. Now that takes us into the late 20th and early 21st century, is posturing, marketing, and media spin, and that's what we are now conditioned to view politics as. And Pope Francis talks at this point about how we view ourselves if we go into public service, into politics. And we do well to ask ourselves, why am I doing this? What am I doing it for? And the other three questions that are underneath there are more of an examination of conscience afterward. He talks about for people who have been in for a while or maybe are retiring. I think it is absolutely a day-by-day thing also, but how much did I put into my work? How much love did I put into my work? What did I do for the progress of our people? And what good did I achieve in the position that was entrusted to me? What good did I achieve in the position that was entrusted to me? And those are some questions that we can all ask ourselves, and we should ask ourselves on a regular basis as a self-examination of conscience. What am I doing to better the world? What am I doing to help those who are more vulnerable? And if the answers are things we don't like, that we're not comfortable with, if we make an honest examination of conscience and we're not comfortable with it, then maybe it's time to confront that in ourselves. So that's chapter 5, and we're moving along at an accurate clip. I don't think I'm ahead of schedule here. Chapter 6 is dialogue and friendship in society. In the last chapter, we mentioned dialogue. Well, what does it mean to dialogue? To dialogue with another person requires the following: approaching that other person, speaking to that other person. There's an asterisk next to this one: listening to other people, listening to another person, looking at another person, coming to know and understand one another, and finding common good. So again, we just kind of go through them again. approaching people who we don't have things in common with, reaching out to them, speaking with them, speaking to somebody who you haven't spoken to before. A few weeks ago, I was in Mass, and I was on that far left side, where there's just one seat off to the side of the pew, and in front of me was a young white college student, and in front of her was a black female who I guessed was either a grad student or maybe a little bit older. And the way the church has got those kneelers set up, it's a little counterintuitive if you're in that front row, because you have to turn around and step back behind you to kneel. And it was pretty clear to me these two had never spoken before. And after the first time we kneeled, when the black woman knelt on the floor, as we got ready for the second time, the white woman did, without hesitation, stepped up and said, "Hey, by the way, this is here." When they walked out of Mass, they were talking like they were old friends, and I'm pretty sure they had never spoken to each other before. So again, approaching and speaking to each other, and listening. We have to listen with an open mind, not with judgment. Looking at is very simple. If you're looking at somebody when you're talking to them, I mean, how often we hear the term "look me in the eye"? Look at somebody in the eye. If you're looking at somebody when you're talking to them, they feel like you're paying attention and hear what they have to say. If you're looking at somebody, looking at your phone while you're talking to them and looking away, you're sending a signal of, "I can't wait to get out of here. I'm really not interested in what you have to say or who you are." So looking at somebody, coming to know and understand one another, this is not something that happens right away, although it did seem to click pretty quickly with these two young women. But coming to know and understand one another is a process. It doesn't take off normally right away. And finding common ground, we all have common ground, no matter what you may think about how different I am from somebody else. We are much more alike than we are different. Each of us can learn something from others. No one is useless and no one is expendable. You'd be surprised what you learn from people who you think have nothing to offer you. You will learn different points of view. You might learn from their experiences as to why they think the way they do about certain topics that you think completely different. And with an open mind and an open heart, you may be able to see, hey, now I have a better understanding of why they think that. I may still think the way I do, but without judgment, with an open mind, you'll understand that. And even if you don't gain anything tangible from that person, I think we all better ourselves from having gone through the experience of talking to others who are completely unlike us and maybe don't really have anything to offer. A pluralistic society encourages dialogue that we just described. It respects the dignity of all persons, of others, in all circumstances. Integrates differences, thus guaranteeing a genuine and lasting peace. Integrating differences doesn't mean we're different and we're over here, we're here and you're here, and we may get this close, but we're not going to really get to know each other. We're not really going to integrate any differences unless you change to my way. I'm not changing to your way. We never actually have peace that way. And pluralistic society encourages dialogue and recognizes other people's rights to be themselves, maintaining an atmosphere of friendliness. If I will only accept you if you change to do what I want you to, do we really have an atmosphere of friendliness, or do we have an atmosphere that my dominating personality or power has overcome you, and you are now kind of having to almost report to me? And that's obviously not what Francis is talking about. He's asking us to allow people to be themselves and accept them for who they are. So what attitudes and actions don't help with dialogue? This is kind of an easy one here. Any aggression we may manifest, for example, on social networks. It's the greatest example. Social networks, because there's some level, if I'm not in the same room with somebody, there's some level of it's easier to say what I'm thinking at that exact moment when my emotions are telling me. Somebody posts something on Facebook that I don't like, that I totally disagree with, and it's political, since we were talking about political charity. And my response really quickly is to type up, "You're an idiot!" Exclamation point sent. That's not going to help with dialogue. It might make me feel better for a few minutes, but if I actually know that person, or if I meet them later on, how is that going to get us to integrating ideas? It's not. Oh, you're the guy who called me an idiot, right? It creates a bit of a wall we don't really need to overcome. Monologues that don't listen to others. Unfortunately, at the moment for y'all, we'll get to questions later on, but this is a bit of a monologue. But if we're having a conversation, but I'm doing all the talking, and you're having to listen, and I'm not letting you get a word in edgewise, that's a monologue. That's not listening to what you're saying. And you're trying to get a word in, I'm like, That's not exactly going to help with dialogue. And the quick and humiliating discrediting of others. Just wave my hand, I don't have time for what you have to say, I need to walk away. Rolling my eyes, shaking my head, sighing. There are all kinds of little things that I can do to another person to tell them that I am not interested in what they have to say. What they have to say doesn't matter. That is not going to help with dialogue. Open mind, even if you disagree. The calls for the ability to recognize other people's rights to be themselves, and this calls to be themselves and to be different, and I think we just explained that. When one part of society exploits all the world has to offer, acting as if the poor didn't exist, there will eventually be consequences. Ignoring the rights of others will erupt in some form of violence, often when least expected. And within the racism scope here, we can go back to last Memorial Day, when George Floyd was killed by a police officer, and it was caught on video. It was not the first time that such an action has been caught on video. It's happened since then, probably at least half a dozen times caught on video. It was horrific, and it was a flashpoint. It caused an eruption in some form of violence. It may not have been expected because it wasn't the only time it's happened, or it wasn't the only time, the first time in many years that it's happened, but it was a tipping point. And again, it was the violence, the protest, which then became violence, came about because one part of society tends to exploit what the world has to offer at the expense of another part of society. That's how it was viewed by the black community, because it was happening again to a guy who didn't deserve it. Shifting to indigenous peoples now. Indigenous peoples also suffer from, and have since we landed on this continent, have suffered from our white dominance, basically. And they are, these indigenous peoples are not opposed to progress, yet theirs is a different notion of progress, often more humanistic than the modern culture of developed people. Now, that is developed people. Those are the words that Pope Francis used. I don't think we should take it to mean we are developed and they are not, and therefore we are greater and they are lesser. What he's pointing out is there are different cultures, and in their culture, indigenous people may be more community-oriented than we are. It is not as he says, not as interested in the notions of progress, more humanistic and more for me. Indigenous peoples traditionally are more concerned about the land. And the statement I gave a little earlier about the fact that the land is not inherited from their ancestors, but borrowed from their children. And I'll go beyond indigenous people when it comes to a feeling of community. The view of Hispanic people is always that there's a tight-knit family. And that also goes with Asian people. And in fact, in all of those societies and those people who come to the United States, you see them living many times more than just husband, wife, and kids under a roof. Grandparents and grandchildren, maybe even uncles and aunts. We, at one point, used to really respect people who took care of their families. And then a lot of people came from Mexico to work in this country, and they would earn their money on cash basis. And what did they do with their money that they earned? They would send virtually all of it home to family. And then that seemed to offend us because they weren't putting it into the economy or something. But this is an attitude, a part of a culture, a Hispanic culture, is looking out for family. So indigenous people with their community and family being more than just nuclear family. And Hispanics and Asians, and here are all three are areas where people of color in particular, who are not just about what is in it for me and what can I get. And it's not meant to benefit, so theirs is not a culture that's meant to benefit the powerful, though driven to create for themselves. Those driven to create for themselves a kind of earthly paradise. Indigenous people tend to be more concerned about the next level, to heaven, the beyond, after death, and getting and reaching paradise. And I think that in a lot of ways, in our humanistic society where we're concerned about what we can get now, we are maybe not considering heaven and the afterlife. We're thinking more about, let me get as close to heaven as I can get now, in order to be as comfortable or more as I can. Intolerance and lack of respect for indigenous popular culture is a form of violence, grounded in a cold and judgmental way of viewing them. A lot of people maybe don't even realize that indigenous people are still here in this country. We did not wipe them out, and they have, they are more than on reservations, although they are also on reservations, which, by the way, are the least useful land, all the good land for farming and all was taken by the powerful white dominant class, and we pushed the indigenous people onto land that basically nobody wanted. So we have to stand in place of others if we're to discover what is genuine or at least understandable in their motivations and concerns. We have to understand them, again through dialogue, as to what is motivating them, what is interesting to them, and why are they thinking the way they do. And we can learn so much more and enrich ourselves so much more from understanding with an open heart. Now, these two photos involve protests involving indigenous people. The first one is on the left is at the Keystone XL pipeline, which most of the protesters there were indigenous people because it was their land that the pipeline was going through and was going to have a severe environmental impact on. Nice way of saying really kind of cause some damage to it. Curiously, when the original plan was made, it was supposed to go through a generally white suburban neighborhood in North Dakota, and that was never going to pass. So they changed the direction of it to go in an area where the people didn't have the clout and the power to fight it off. And yet they did. And as you can see on the left, this woman is saying we are protectors, not protesters. And that is because they see themselves as the protectors of their land, which is for the children. And I'm not asking you to agree or disagree on the politics of this. I'm asking you to understand their perspective and their point of view. On the right side here is what appears to be, maybe simply because the man is shirtless and is carrying, actually it looks to be some kind of a horn maybe, but something in his hand that it looks a little more threatening. But this is from last 4th of July time when we had a large celebration at Mount Rushmore. Mount Rushmore, a great American landmark and national park. It's also before the presidents were chiseled onto that rock, it was a very important part of the Lakota Nation, and it still is to them. So, bloody hands on stolen lands, honor the treaties. These are some of this is what was going on in their mind from their perspective. And let's be honest with ourselves. Their position isn't pointless. We have to have an understanding of where they're coming from. Their position has some merit to it, and we have to address that and acknowledge it. So, Pope Francis finds in dialogue and friendship and society that there's kindness. And kindness can change the whole world, basically. Kindness frees us from the cruelty that at times infects human relationship. Those areas of unhelpful to dialogue that we talked about. Those areas in chapter 1 about the dark clouds on a closed world. And then it's got a lot of F's in this, nice alliteration. Kindness frees us from the frantic flurry of activity that forgets that others also have a right to be happy. It's not just about me and mine, it's about others also. And if and when we view the world in that way, we are able to engage in acts of kindness. As to kindness, Pope Francis says, yet every now and then a kind person appears and is willing to set everything else aside in order to show interest, to give the gift of a smile, to speak a word of encouragement, and to listen amid general indifference. If we make a daily effort to do exactly this, we can create a healthy social atmosphere in which misunderstandings can be overcome and conflict forestalled. So, showing interest, giving the gift of a smile, speaking a word of encouragement, can change somebody's whole day without our knowing it. Just a simple matter of being nice. Precisely because it entails esteem and respect for others. Once kindness becomes a culture within society, it transforms lifestyles, relationships, and the ways ideas are discussed and compared. So going back to every once in a while, a random act of kindness is a good start. But when we're all doing it on a regular basis, we change a culture. In organizations, they talk about culture a lot. What is the culture of an organization? Is it managed by somebody who is a tyrant, or is it managed by somebody who is trying to build up those underneath it? It's something that if you're going seeking employment, you want to know these kinds of things because nobody wants to be miserable in their job. And so that culture is not changed because it's Friday and I decided to be a nice guy. It's changed because we do this over and over and over again until it becomes the norm. And so what he's talking about is making kindness the norm. Chapter 7, Paths of Renewed Encounter. Often the more vulnerable members of society are the victims of unfair generalizations. If at times the poor and dispossessed react with attitudes that appear antisocial, we should realize that in many cases those reactions are born of a history of scorn and social exclusion. Inequality and lack of integral human development make peace impossible. And again, from the scope of racism in the United States and looking at last summer, when protests broke out and then protests were amped up to the point where there was violence, so many people were so outraged about the burning of a Target in a city, or a Target superstore in a city. And that was bad, sure. But was the outrage the same about the burning of that property as it was about the killing of the man that set this all off in the first place? And if it was, it wasn't vocalized nearly as much. And so the people who were protesting and the people who were supporting the protest felt that viscerally. They felt, why is it that you're more concerned about property than you are about people, our people? And it comes down to, again, an examination of, are we viewing those people as opposed to us? Is it us and them, or is it all us? And if it's all us, we should be outraged by that. Last week I mentioned two systems of justice. I'll throw another one out there. In May of 2020, in June of 2020, on the left there is a Black Lives Matter protest in North Carolina. It's in a mid-city, it's not in a big city in North Carolina. But this was a peaceful protest, but the people didn't go home at the time the permit expired. And so the police in this location pepper sprayed them. And you can see that very clearly here, that they're being pepper sprayed. On the right, I think it was in June, also in June of last year, there was a rally are protests, armed protests, at the Capitol in Lansing, Michigan. And as you can see, the man, very aggressive, right up into the face of these two police officers who are wearing masks. And notice here in the middle of the pandemic, this man right up into their face, yelling at them from a foot and a half away, is not wearing a mask. He's also, you can't see it from this picture, but he and the many others like him, who are all right up in the faces of these people, are armed with assault rifles. Look at the difference of the treatment in those two pictures there. The restraint shown on the picture on the right is, I would think, is what we really should be striving for in all of these pictures. I'm not going to say, why didn't they do to him and those people what they did to those people? My question is, why did they do to these people what they did to them instead of doing to those people? And what it shows is there is a capability of restraint there. When injustices have occurred on both sides, it is important to take into clear account whether they were equally grave or in any way comparable. Violence perpetrated by the state using its structures and power is not on the same level as those perpetrated by particular groups. And so thinking about it, what he's saying is state power over its people is worse than rival groups of people. On the path toward peace, the processes of renewed encounter are very necessary. In true reconciliation, in common projects that do not deny each person's individuality, in recognizing, protecting, and restoring the dignity of all persons. Recognizing, protecting, and restoring. Restoring in particular would go to those whose dignity has not been recognized historically in history. In the option for the poor, the dispossessed, and the discarded. That again is, we are obligated to be reaching out to the poor, the dispossessed, and the discarded in society. And understanding and appreciating the meaning of forgiveness. Jesus never promoted violence or intolerance. A lot of people want to look at he took that whip to the money changers. He openly condemned the use of force to gain power over others. So what that was really about was the idea that the money changers were exercising power wrongly over the people. But he did not promote violence, even when Peter sliced the ear of the gardener. He told him, put your sword away. The gospel tells us to forgive 70 times 7 times. My understanding on this, and I could be wrong, is that the numbers in the Bible often meant something symbolically, and that 7 was generally perfection. In fact, 6 is imperfection, and 3 is perfection, which is why 666 is perfectly imperfect, the devil. 7 is perfection. So I don't think that the gospel is telling us you have to forgive 490 times and then you're free. I think he's basically saying forgive all the time. Memory. On paths of renewed encounter, if we are going to renew, if we are going to reconcile, memory is important. Forgetting is not the answer. We must not forget. Now, he talks a little bit about just war in this chapter also. So he talks about we must not forget the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It's the only time in the history of mankind that type of weaponry has been used on a population. Thankfully, it's never been used again, but after seeing what it did and the long-lasting effects over generations, he's saying we must never forget those being dropped. We must also never forget the persecutions, the slave trade, and the ethnic killings, which I mentioned some of those persecutions and ethnic killings earlier. We cannot allow the present and future generations to lose the memory of what happened. The number of people nowadays, I think is something like 1 in 4, who don't believe the Holocaust occurred, and that occurred less than 100 years ago, and it's pretty well documented, and yet people want to forget it because it was so long ago. Slavery was even longer ago. And it is the memory that ensures the building of a more fraternal future. Unless we're willing to remember and acknowledge, we are never going to get to peace. It is easy to be tempted to turn the page, to say that all that happened so long ago and we should look to the future. And these are his words here. For God's sake, no. You cannot just pretend it's in the past. You know, if I have gotten the benefit of, as a white male, of all these steps ahead, and now we want to say, okay, everything's equal. I'm still starting on the 5-yard line and others are starting on their own 20. It's just not equal, and we have to do more. We can never move forward without remembering the past. We do not progress without an honest and unclouded memory. Honest and unclouded means we need to know what it was honestly, not try to spin it back into something that makes us feel better. We need to keep the flame of collective conscience bearing witness to succeeding generations to the horror of what happened, because that awakens and preserves the memory of the victims, so that the conscience of humanity may rise up in the face of every desire for dominance and destruction. On that note, in Germany, there are all kinds of little monuments, often now in the street, plugged into the street with just somebody's name, of a Jewish family that was taken out of their house, in front of their house, and sent to concentration camps or wiped out. In South Africa, after the white minority was taken from power and apartheid ended, they had truth and reconciliation courts. They didn't go just rape and pillage. They had these reconciliations to reach a fair and forgiving future for them. In the United States, we have never acknowledged the sin of slavery. Slavery is bad. Yeah, we said that. But then we said it so long ago. Don't worry about it. We've never acknowledged the sin of Jim Crow. We've never acknowledged the sins that we have done. We've just simply revamped them and moved on and said, why do you want to talk about it? How many times do we hear people talk about it and say, why is everything about race with you? Why can't you just get past it? Because we have never acknowledged it. And until we acknowledge the extent of racism in this country, we will not move forward with a renewed encounter. Death penalty. So he adds very late in chapter 7, Pope Francis talks a little bit about the death penalty. He does not create something new. In fact, the Fratelli Tutti used 287 paragraphs and 288 footnotes. If you read the footnotes, you're a better person than I am. I didn't read them all. But if you look at them, you will find that, like with his prior encyclicals, like with all of these popes' encyclicals, they don't just pull things out of the air. They're usually borrowing them almost always borrowing them from previous popes. And so here he is borrowing right away from St. John Paul II. He stated clearly and firmly that the death penalty is inadequate from a moral standpoint and no longer necessary from that of penal justice. There can be no stepping back from this position. And then this is his position now, just to affirm it a little further. Today, we state clearly that the death penalty is inadmissible, and the Church is firmly committed to calling for its abolition worldwide. Not just here in America, worldwide. All Christians and people of goodwill are today called to work not only for the abolition of the death penalty, legal or illegal, in all its forms, but also to work for the improvement of prison conditions out of respect for the human dignity of persons deprived of their freedom. Fear and resentment can easily lead to viewing punishment in a vindictive and even cruel way, rather than as part of a process of healing and reintegration into society. By the way, most of the developed world has abolished the death penalty across the board, and see those few countries that keep it, as being somewhat barbaric. There is at times a tendency to deliberately fabricate enemies, stereotype figures who represent all the characteristics that society perceives or interprets as threatening. Again, those people. And because those people are threatening to us, it's easier to execute somebody from one of those people. The mechanisms that form these images are the same that allow the spread of racist ideas in their time. And then he goes on from a more personal aspect of it. Not even a murderer loses personal integrity and and God himself pledges to guarantee this. And Catholic race theology talks about the fact that all God's people are the same and all God's people are due dignity. The firm rejection of the death penalty shows to what extent it is possible to recognize the inalienable dignity of every human being. And if you remember, we heard about inalienable dignity probably about a half a dozen times earlier. If I do not deny that dignity to the worst of criminals, I will not deny it to anyone. So if you can deny and maintain dignity for the worst of the worst, which you do by allowing people to have the ability to change, then you can have an open eye toward everyone. Okay, so I'm going to skip chapter 8 right here because there's two things I really wanted to get to, and I'm running very low on time. But this is just that the church is home with open doors that serves, breaks down walls and builds bridges, sows seeds in reconciliation and sustains hope. And I'm going to skip that one also and see if I can get, this is a 5-minute video that I'm going to see if I can get to work. If not, I can do it from here. I think. It's not coming up. Okay, I'm going to skip the video, unfortunately, then. It's really good. Again, 5 minutes by the Vatican to music and pictures. It's very beautiful. And let me jump to a quick, I'm going to cover these on here so that anybody watching on YouTube can pull it up and freeze it. But some books that address racism, and I've read them all, so I can recommend them. Cast by Isabella Wilkerson is out. It came out in 2020. She's a Pulitzer Prize winner. It's phenomenal, beautifully written. Me and White Supremacy by Layla Said is very good. It's aimed more at her as a black Muslim woman born in England, talking to white women in particular. It has a discussion workbook as well. Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates came out. Basically it's a love letter to his son about the death of an unarmed man in Prince George's County that he had gone to high school with. The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness tracks how we went from slavery to Jim Crow to mass incarceration by Michelle Alexander, a Cornell law professor. So you want to talk about race by Ijeoma Oluwa. Fire Next Time is a classic by James Baldwin, written in the 60s. Stamped from the Beginning, and also How to Be an Anti-Racist, which is being more than just not racist, but an anti-racist, somebody challenging it, by Ibram X. Kendi. He is a Virginia law professor. Just Mercy by Brian Stevenson. There's also a movie. They're both phenomenal. The book is actually better. It covers more than the movie could. And Racial Justice in the Catholic Church by Father Brian Massengill, who I had mentioned last week. He's a priest and a professor at Fordham University. Movies that address racism. White Savior, Racism in the American Church, not aimed at Catholic in particular, but American Christian Church. It's an hour-long documentary that I saw a few weeks ago. It's excellent. John Lewis, Good Trouble, and John Lewis, Getting Away are great documentaries. 13th, about the 13th Amendment. And I threw in Gentleman's Agreement from 1947, starring Cary Grant, which is about anti-Semitism, where he kind of is a reporter who goes undercover. YouTube, a great place to find stuff. A great place to find terrible stuff, but it's a great place to find things addressing racism in the church. And I'm going to give you 4 of them right here. I mentioned Gloria Purvis last week. I don't know whether people will be able to freeze on their computer and blow it up, but it actually has the link on here. But if you simply Google the name Conversations That Matter, the intersection of racial justice and life issues, it'll pull you up on the McGrath Institute at Notre Dame. And Racism, the Enduring Assault Against Human Life and Dignity is excellent. It's an hour and 6 minutes long. And then 3 by Father Brian Massengill, How the Church Can Combat Racism and White Privilege, which is 25 minutes long. Unconscious Racial Bias and a Challenge of Solidarity, which was done in July of 2015. So this was after Tamir Rice and Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown. It was before the most recent spate of killings of unarmed black people that set off the most recent set of protests and to some extent consciousness for us to start doing more. And finally, the race sitting in the church, which she did in September 30th of 2020, which directly addresses how we are not often honest with ourselves and some of the shortcomings of the church itself in dealing with racism. It was directed toward, I watched it live on September 30th, it was really directed toward some Black Catholics across the country and some Black Catholic organizations, including clergy and nuns, some of the religious orders. It's excellent. He may be a little bit critical. He is a little bit critical of Open Wide Our Hearts. He says it doesn't go far enough, but it's visceral, it's great, it's an hour and a half long, and I think those are some really good reading materials if you're interested. Also, one quick shout out, Open Wide Our Hearts and the Social Justice of the Saints and Social Justice. We're starting the small group sessions. If you're not signed up for one, try to sign up for one. If you're interested in leading one, get with Father. But those are going to be starting, I believe, as early as this Thursday or so, after Ash Wednesday. And so we are looking through St. Martin de Porres to do more in addressing these issues. We had plans to do it starting last year, but something came up that kind of shut us down. I can't remember what that was. But we have a lot more planned to be a lot more active, and this is a continuing program. It is not just a 1 year or 5 week issue. Thanks for your attention. I think it's 10:55 out of 10.